I think it's been claimed as a revolutionary document, and that's part of a long history of debate surrounding Magna Carta. I doubt if it was seen as a revolutionary document in its day, except by those who chose to see it as such. And I wouldn't have thought it wouldn't have become a revolutionary document until the Civil War, when it was used by factions within the Civil War. But even within that, there were those who saw it as quite a reactionary document that supported property rights, as well as constraining the crown, or the powers of the crown. So I think you can only see it as a revolutionary document in retrospect and from a very narrow perspective. I guess you might claim that the middle classes would later use it to establish their property rights, just as the barons had before them. But I don't think in the bumper book of revolutionary documents, Magna Carta would feature, unfortunately. But I think it's been seen within English law as a key document that says that that property isn't the sole preserve of the crown. But as I say, it's probably the Charter of the Forest that's actually more important in that regard. But I think that's a question for lawyers rather than for a historian, I think. I think in the Civil War there is a debate about the status of Magna Carta, whether the Republicans should be using Magna Carta as a claim. So although it's about constraining the crown, it is about this notion of property. And for some groups in the Civil War, there is an argument about property, whether property should be the common ownership, should be common ownership of property. And amongst those groups, such as the Levellers, Magna Carta would have been seen, was viewed with suspicion. So I guess, again, one of the things I think the interesting thing is how malleable Magna Carta actually is. I mean, it's pretty much of a nothing document, actually. I think there's one or two phrases that people pick out, such as sort of freedom of arrest without trial, and then apply it. But actually, most of the document is about sorting out who owns what, and about trying to end grievances with the crown. So because of that, because of its almost vagueness, it can be used in lots and lots of ways to establish different sorts of arguments. So for example, in terms of empire, it's used over and over again to say, well, look, here's this document which is really, really important, which suggests that England or Britain, because the two become conflated, has a long history of rule of law and is therefore more civilized than those who we're seeking to civilize. So it's the Bible on one hand and Magna Carta on the other. And then you can put down one and reach for the gun and enslave lots and lots of different people on the claim that you're bringing them freedom. So there's a number of historians, and particularly US historians, have looked at the use of Magna Carta on the frontier in terms of claiming that you could claim indigenous people's lands in the new United States and before that in the colony. And you can justify that by saying, well, you're doing it under rule of law. You understand what it means to own property, but clearly these savages don't. Nor do they understand the Bible, they don't understand Christ, they don't understand property, so therefore they're less than us. And they don't understand land ownership in the same way as us, so we can take the land from them. And so it's therefore used, and you can see it just used in a number of occasions like that somehow Magna Carta is a mark of superiority over those peoples who you deem inferior. And it's still used by the right wing in that way, actually, interestingly enough. There are a number of fascist groups who use Magna Carta in that way. And part of that is this misreading of what Magna Carta was, so they project back into the past that Magna Carta is some sort of revolutionary document that was produced in terms of trying to overthrow Norman yoke, and then forget that the barons standing there are actually Norman, and as Norman as the king is. And this is an internal dispute between the ruling, amongst the ruling class. And it isn't necessarily an attempt to overthrow a particular system. I mean, no, I don't think any of those barons are arguing that there shouldn't be a king. It's that they think that John should be constrained because he's overstepped the mark. And it may be seen as one of the earliest tax avoidance schemes in that regard. They feel overtaxed by John. But there's lots and lots of stuff missing. The thing I'm interested as well is the way that Magna Carta covers up other parts of history. So, for example, although we're going to celebrate 1215, a year later is the most successful invasion of England ever. And it's a Scottish king that achieves that. Alexander II gets to the Kent coastline and is waiting for, essentially, he's waiting for the French to arrive and really to establish and overthrow John and establish a new monarchy. And unfortunately, John dies, which is probably the best thing he ever did for England. And the Pope decides that Henry, his son, should be king. And Alexander II packs up and returns back up to Scotland. But none of that seems to be figured in. And when, there's an interesting thing that people have been talking about whether this is a British celebration or an English celebration. And I think it gets very little resonance in Scotland because Scotland has a different legal system, has a different approach to property rights, and has a different educational system as well. And sort of Magna Carta doesn't feature either in the legal or the educational system. So from a Scottish perspective, we would probably celebrate the invasion of England more than the document. I mean, other uses of Magna Carta has been, I think, even as late as the 1930s, Stanley Baldwin was using Magna Carta to say to attempts at Indian independence that they should take a gradual approach towards having more say in their own affairs and not independence. And at Magna Carta, he was citing Magna Carta in that debate. Although others have thought otherwise. Michael Portillo, for example, has recently suggested in a radio programme that speech is about anti-authoritarian, anti-fascism, anti-communism. And yes, you could read that speech that way, but I think that's to misunderstand the history of the way that the Conservatives and right-wing have used Magna Carta to argue for, again, this idea that somehow England has this privilege of a long understanding of what liberty is, and others should just agree to what that definition is, which usually means their lack of liberty. So there's that. I mean, I don't even think these are abuses, by the way. I think they're just uses. I think the argument is completely open. At the last big commemoration or celebration of Magna Carta, I think it's the left had quite a lot of influence and actually used Magna Carta, or attempted to use Magna Carta as a political argument as well, the left in England. So you see a lot of people getting around the idea of using Magna Carta to about constraining authority and using that sort of argument. So it's not as if this is particularly just the right that uses particular parts of history in terms of stating their position. And I think that's the most important thing about Magna Carta. As I said, it's so malleable, you can almost from any political position pick something out. Kipling would, in the last years of the 19th century, would use Magna Carta in his poetry to argue against South African separation. And and that poem, one poem in particular, which was published not just in London, but I think it was in New York or Boston, published at the same time. He's using that idea of Magna Carta to the United States to say, you may feel some sympathy with the South African, with the Boers in South Africa, demanding independence, or actually not even that, trying to establish a bit more autonomy. But Magna Carta, we've got Magna Carta. We know about freedom. And it's all that old idea again that somehow a country that's established a world empire turns around and says to people, well, actually, we still know more about liberty than you do. It's also featured as a sense of what it means to be English, and again conflated with what it means to be British. So typically H.E. Marshall's 1905 book, Our Island Story, has been picked up by various politicians, including Michael Gove, as some sort of accurate account of a historical account of the nation, where Marshall actually saw it much more as a fun book for boys and girls, as she would have put it. And now it's been transposed into this landmark teaching aid that features, of course, Magna Carta as a starting point of English liberty. But it's that sort of strange misuse of simplistic versions of the past that I find problematic. It's similar to the Ladybird book, where John is portrayed as this evil bloke that needs to be taken in hand. So those sort of constructions of the past are unhelpful. It's actually unhelpful to think that you can construct the past as a children's story and then build your national identity on it. That's just far too simplistic. Well, at the moment, I think the right are winning the tug of war. I mean, I think it's a really, really hard job for institutions like the British Library, for example, to be able to put anything on. In the same year as the general election and the possible breakup of Britain with the referendum in Scotland, I think it's a hard task to remain politically neutral, with trying to represent or try to suggest what Magna Carta represents in terms of public history. But I think if you look at the 800 Committee and you look at the people round about it, I don't think you'd accuse any of them of being socialists or libertarians or perhaps even sort of members of the Labour Party. I don't think there's many. So yeah, I think it's I think it's been fairly much captured by one political, and that's a shame actually. It's a shame because I don't think it needed to be like that. It could have been represented as and I think in the end of the day, people like British Library will have to do that. They'll have to represent it as the history of a debate. But generally, it's been a document that's played out more for the people in power than the people not in power.